Comrades, there comes a moment in every era when the world trembles not because the powerful have spoken, but because the powerless have opened their eyes. Today, I tell you this. The greatest danger to the ruling class is not revolution itself, it is the working class becoming conscious that the world they suffer in was built by their own hands. A sleeping world is easy to exploit, but a waking one becomes unstoppable. We live in a society where wealth piles up in the hands of the few, while misery and exhaustion gather in the homes of the many. The capitalist system, praised as freedom, has chained workers to the very machines they created. You produce everything, yet own nothing. You build the wealth of nations, yet struggle to secure the necessities of life. You generate profit, yet see your time, your body, and your mind consumed as raw material for someone else's gain. This is no accident. It is the design of a system that thrives on your forgetfulness of your power, your unity, your collective strength. The bourgeoisie has always ruled not because they are strong, but because the working masses have been kept divided, distracted, and asleep. They manufacture illusions. The illusion that exploitation is natural, that inequality is inevitable, that your suffering is a personal failure rather than a structural theft. Capitalism does not merely shape your working hours, it shapes your consciousness itself. But consciousness is not a gift, it is a struggle. It is born when the worker looks beyond the veil of daily survival and sees the architecture of domination. When the laborer realizes that poverty exists not because they have too little, but because someone else has too much. When the exploited recognize that the wealth of the rich is nothing but the accumulated labor of the poor. When you understand this, the world shifts, the fog clears, the system's lies collapse. The ruling class fears this awakening more than they fear any weapon. They know that the moment workers gain clear sight, the foundations of capitalism begin to crack. For capitalism survives only through the illusion of permanence. It tells you there is no alternative. It tells you this is the natural order. But history, my friends, is nothing but the record of those who broke natural orders and constructed new ones through collective will. Look at your own conditions. Every hour of your labor, you produce value beyond what you receive. That difference, Marx called it surplus value, is the lifeblood of capitalism. It is the stolen hours of your existence transformed into profit. As you sleep, as you work, as you struggle to breathe under rising prices and stagnant wages, someone else becomes unimaginably wealthy from the very energy of your being. And yet the system demands gratitude from those it exploits most. This is why awakening is revolutionary, not because it creates rebellion in your heart, but because it reveals the rebellion that has always existed in the structure of society itself. Class struggle is not an option, it is the engine that already drives history forward. The question is not whether you are part of the struggle. The question is whether you are conscious of it. When workers awaken, they see each other not as competitors but as comrades. They understand that no individual can break chains forged collectively. Only through organization, through unions, councils, movements, and solidarity can the exploited class rise to reclaim its rightful power. Only through unity can you transform scattered suffering into coordinated strength. Only through collective action can you dismantle the machinery that has fed on your lives. This awakening does not ask permission. It does not negotiate with systems built on theft. It does not politely request dignity. It demands transformation at the roots. It declares that a world where a few consume the future while the many are denied the present is a world unfit for human beings. It proclaims that liberation is not given, it is seized. Comrades, consciousness is the spark, organization is the fire, revolution is the inevitable blaze. And today, in this moment, something is stirring. The sleeping world is shifting in its slumber. Workers are beginning to question, to connect, to speak, to resist. The birth of consciousness is not quiet, it is the sound of chains being recognized as chains. So I call upon you, awaken, rise. Study your condition. See the world as it truly is, not as the ruling class paints it. Recognize that you are the makers of history, the builders of society, the source of all wealth, all production, all progress. And understand that once you awaken, the world itself must change. For the sleeping world may belong to the capitalists, but the waking world will belong to the workers. Comrades, the birth of consciousness has begun. Now carry it forward. Awakening is the greatest threat to the ruling class because the entire architecture of their dominance rests on the assumption that the exploited do not fully understand the mechanisms of their own exploitation. Power in class society is not maintained through force alone. It is maintained through illusion, consent manufactured by habit, and the quiet acceptance of conditions that seem natural only because they are familiar. When workers remain unaware of the origins of their suffering, they direct their frustration inward, blaming themselves for what is in fact a structural theft woven into the fabric of capitalist society. But when they awaken, when they begin to see the world with clear eyes, the ruling class faces not an individual rebel but a rising consciousness that cannot be pacified, bought off, or intimidated because it is rooted in truth itself. To awaken is to recognize that the wealth of the ruling class is nothing more than the concentrated product of labor extracted from millions of ordinary people. It is to understand that poverty is not created by scarcity but by systems that restrict access to what workers themselves produce. The ruling class depends on keeping this relationship invisible. They need workers to believe that capitalism is an inevitable condition of human life, that hierarchy is natural, that inequality is a consequence of talent rather than a precondition of exploitation. They rely on confusion, division, and distraction to ensure that individuals never see themselves as part of a collective force, with the capacity to overturn the very structures that oppress them. Awakening shatters this illusion. It reveals that every factory, every office, every field, every network, every institution runs only because workers move, think, create, and cooperate. The capitalist contributes nothing to production except the ownership of what others have built. When this becomes clear, the mystique of the ruling class dissolves. They are exposed as parasites living off the energy and creativity of the people they dominate, and a truth like that cannot be unlearned. Once someone sees the machinery of exploitation, the gears of consciousness begin to turn, turning isolated anger into organized purpose. The ruling class fears this because once workers awaken, they begin to question not just their wages or their hours, but the entire legitimacy of the economic order. They begin to ask why they should sell their labor to survive when they are the ones who produce all value. They begin to refuse the idea that a small minority has any moral right to control the resources of society. They begin to resist the narratives that justify exploitation, the idea that competition is the law of life, that wealth reflects virtue, that suffering is a personal failure. Consciousness exposes these stories as ideological weapons, designed to maintain submission. Awakening spreads. One worker speaks to another, one insight becomes a collective understanding, one moment of recognition amplifies into a class-wide shift in perception. And when consciousness spreads, unity becomes possible. The ruling class depends on fragmentation, workers divided by industry, race, region, nationality, gender, contract type, and countless other distinctions. They invest heavily in ideological tools that make workers see each other as rivals. But when consciousness rises, workers see these divisions as deliberate barriers placed between them to prevent solidarity. They recognize their shared interests and understand that their liberation is bound together. This transformation from isolated individuals to a collective class aware of its power is the nightmare of every ruling elite. For once the workers awaken, they discover that the ruling class is vastly outnumbered. They realize that the wealthy are not invincible but dependent on the obedience of those they exploit. The masses produce everything. The ruling class produces nothing without them. Consciousness reveals that the real power has always belonged to the many, not the few. And when the many recognize this, when they stop accepting the terms imposed on them, the system begins to tremble. Every strike, every refusal, every act of solidarity becomes a blow against the structure of domination. Awakening is dangerous because it transforms fear into clarity. It replaces resignation with determination. It turns desperation into organization. And once consciousness takes root, The ruling class has no defense strong enough to suppress the rising will of workers who finally understand that they are not mere participants in history, but its true makers. Capitalism survives by keeping workers divided, exhausted, and unconscious because its power depends on preventing the very people who create all wealth from recognizing their shared interests and collective strength. The system is designed not merely to extract labor, but to shape the conditions of life so profoundly that workers remain too overwhelmed to question, too isolated to unite, and too distracted to understand the roots of their exploitation. Division, exhaustion, and unconsciousness are not accidental byproducts of capitalism. They are essential pillars of its survival, cultivated deliberately through economic structures, ideological narratives, and social arrangements that ensure workers remain in a state of disorganization and obedience. Division is the first line of defense. Capitalism thrives when workers perceive each other as competitors rather than comrades. It fragments them across countless boundaries: skill level, job title, industry, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, immigration status, region, contract type, and even the illusion of individual achievement. The system constantly reminds workers that their survival depends on outperforming one another, creating a false sense of scarcity that turns collective solidarity into individual struggle. By doing so, capitalism ensures that workers blame each other for low wages, unemployment, and poor conditions rather than directing their anger toward the ruling class that orchestrates these realities. When workers see one another as threats rather than allies, they cannot unite, and without unity, they cannot challenge the structures that oppress them. Exhaustion is the second weapon. Capitalism demands relentless labor, not just physical or mental work, but the continuous expenditure of emotional energy required to navigate insecurity. Workers are pushed to the brink through long hours, unpredictable schedules, rising costs of living, stagnant wages, and constant fear of losing the little they have. The system ensures that workers are too drained to think critically, too tired to organize, too overwhelmed to resist. Even leisure time is colonized by the pressures of survival, leaving no space for reflection or political consciousness. Exhaustion becomes a form of control. A fatigued population does not rebel, it endures. A drained worker does not imagine a better world, they cling to whatever stability they can find. The ruling class understands that as long as workers remain exhausted, they will not have the energy to challenge the system that exploits them. Unconsciousness is the final and most dangerous tool because it shapes the very way workers perceive reality. Capitalism produces ideologies that normalize inequality, justify exploitation, and obscure the true relations of power. It teaches workers to internalize failure as personal inadequacy rather than recognizing it as a structural outcome. It convinces them that wealth is a sign of merit, that poverty is an individual fault, and that the world as it exists is natural and unchangeable. Through media, culture, education, and political discourse, the capitalist class cultivates a worldview in which workers cannot see the exploitation they live within every day. They are encouraged to dream of joining the ruling class rather than questioning why it exists at all. This unconsciousness blinds workers to their own power, making them accept a system that depends entirely on their labor, yet denies them dignity, security, and autonomy. These three mechanisms, division, exhaustion, and unconsciousness, function together to keep the working class disorganized and submissive. A divided workforce cannot unite, an exhausted workforce cannot resist, and an unconscious workforce cannot even recognize its own chains. This combination ensures that capitalism maintains stability despite being fundamentally unstable, unjust, and exploitative. The ruling class does not need to control workers through overt violence when it has already shaped their daily lives in ways that prevent rebellion from forming in the first place. Yet the very need for these mechanisms exposes capitalism's inherent fragility. A system that must constantly divide people reveals its fear of unity. A system that exhausts workers reveals its dependence on their endless labor. A system that requires unconsciousness reveals that consciousness is its greatest threat. If workers ever see clearly, ever rest enough to think, ever unify across the artificial lines drawn between them, the entire structure of capitalism would be at risk. The ruling class knows this. which is why it fights so fiercely to preserve conditions that keep workers fragmented, fatigued, and misled. But history shows that these conditions cannot hold forever. When workers begin to recognize their shared suffering, when exhaustion turns to anger, when unconsciousness becomes awareness, the forces that capitalism relies on begin to falter. And in that awakening lies the possibility of transformation, the emergence of a class that finally understands its strength and refuses to remain divided, exhausted, and unconscious any longer. The wealth of the bourgeoisie is built entirely on the surplus labor of the working class, because the capitalist system functions by extracting more value from workers than it returns to them. This difference, which Marx called surplus value, is the hidden foundation of all profit, all capital accumulation, and all economic power held by the ruling class. Workers sell their labor power for wages, but the value they create during their working hours far exceeds the amount they are paid. This excess produced through their time, effort, and creativity is appropriated by the owners of production, who contribute no labor themselves yet claim ownership over the products of labor. In this way, the wealth of the bourgeoisie is nothing more than crystallized labor stolen from the working class. When a worker enters a factory, an office, a farm, or a warehouse, they receive a wage that reflects only a portion of the value they will produce. For example, a worker may generate enough value in the first few hours of the day to cover their wage. But they continue working beyond that point, and every additional hour creates surplus value that flows directly into the pockets of the capitalist. The worker's labor produces commodities or services that are sold for profit, but the worker does not receive the profit. They receive only the minimum necessary to keep them returning to work, food, shelter, basic survival. Everything beyond that is seized by the bourgeoisie, who expand their wealth while the workers' conditions remain stagnant or worsen. This theft is not personal. It is systemic, woven into the fundamental structure of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie frames this relationship as fair exchange, as if wages represent equal compensation for labor. But this is a deliberate illusion. If wages truly represented the full value created by workers, there would be no profit. Capitalism requires that workers be underpaid relative to the value of what they produce. Profit exists only because labor produces more than it costs. This difference is the source of all capitalist wealth. Every mansion, every factory network, every corporation, every luxury of the ruling class is built from surplus labor extracted from workers who are denied the full fruits of their effort. The bourgeoisie owns the means of production not because they created them, but because they historically seized them and maintain their grip through economic and political power. Surplus labor does more than enrich individual capitalists. It fuels the expansion of capitalism itself. Surplus value becomes capital, and capital is reinvested to generate more surplus value. The workers' unpaid labor is transformed into machinery, technology, infrastructure, and production networks that further strengthen the control of the ruling class. In this way, the worker produces not only commodities but also the very conditions of their own exploitation. Each cycle of production deepens the wealth of the bourgeoisie and entrenches the dependency of the working class. This is why the system appears natural and self-perpetuating. Workers create the wealth that oppresses them, and the bourgeoisie uses that wealth to reproduce the same relations of domination. The bourgeoisie often claims that their wealth comes from innovation, risk-taking, or superior intelligence. But none of these narratives withstand scrutiny. No idea, no invention, no investment produces value without labor. Machines do not create value, they only transfer it. Money does not create value, it only commands labor. Ownership is not production, it is control over production. The capitalist class obscures this truth because to expose it would reveal that their wealth is unearned, that their power rests on exploitation, and that their dominance depends entirely on the continued extraction of surplus labor from workers who do not realize the extent of what is taken from them. The working class, by contrast, possesses none of the wealth it creates. Its labor produces everything: food, clothing, technology, transportation, buildings, energy, art, infrastructure, and every commodity that circulates in society. Yet workers receive only enough to reproduce their labor power, never enough to accumulate capital. This ensures they remain dependent on selling their labor day after day. The bourgeoisie maintains its wealth not because it works harder, but because it ensures that workers cannot escape the necessity of working. Poverty at the bottom creates security at the top. Understanding that the wealth of the bourgeoisie is built entirely on surplus labor is revolutionary because it reveals that workers are the true creators of society's wealth. It exposes that exploitation is not a matter of unfair wages, but an inherent feature of capitalism. It shows that the ruling class contributes nothing essential to production, and that the power they wield is sustained by the unpaid labor of the many. Once this truth becomes clear, the legitimacy of capitalist ownership begins to collapse, and with it, the illusions that sustain bourgeois power. Class struggle is the engine of history, whether workers are aware of it or not, because every society built on unequal ownership of the means of production inevitably becomes a battlefield between those who labor and those who profit from that labor. The history of human civilization is not a peaceful evolution of ideas or the smooth progression of technology. It is the continuous clash of opposing classes whose material interests cannot be reconciled. From the ancient slave societies to feudal monarchies and into modern capitalism, every era has been shaped by conflict between those who produce and those who exploit production. Even when this struggle is hidden beneath everyday routine, even when workers believe they are simply trying to survive, the structural tension remains, driving social change forward regardless of individual awareness. Class struggle is not optional, not a matter of personal belief or political preference. It is embedded in the economic structure of society itself. When workers are unaware of this struggle, it does not disappear. It simply operates in favor of the ruling class. The bourgeoisie understands the mechanisms of power, even if it never names them openly. It organizes society to protect its interests, deploys ideology to mask exploitation, and uses institutions like the state, law, and education to stabilize its dominance. Meanwhile, workers confront the consequences of class struggle: low wages, rising prices, insecurity, inequality, without recognizing their source. This lack of awareness makes the struggle one-sided. The ruling class fights consciously to preserve its privileges, while the working class suffers unconsciously within a system designed to extract value from their lives. But even in this state of unawareness, conflict persists. In every wage negotiation, every layoff, every price hike, every attempt by the bourgeoisie to lower labor costs, increase productivity, or expand markets at the expense of workers' well-being. The engines of historical transformation ignite when this struggle becomes consciously recognized by the exploited majority. Awareness does not create conflict, it reveals it. When workers begin to understand that their hardships are not isolated or accidental but the inevitable outcome of capitalist relations, the struggle shifts from a quiet pressure to an active confrontation. Consciousness transforms spontaneous acts of resistance into organized action. Strikes, protests, unions, and revolutionary movements emerge not from sudden anger but from the recognition that workers share common conditions and common enemies. When class struggle becomes conscious, the exploited cease to see their oppression as natural and begin to understand it as historical and changeable. This is the moment when history accelerates, when the engine of class struggle becomes powerful enough to reshape society itself. The ruling class fears this transition because it knows that its power rests on the illusion of harmony. It promotes the idea that all members of society share the same interests, that success is achievable through individual effort, and that social order is neutral and fair. But beneath these narratives lies the material truth that the interests of capital and labor are fundamentally opposed. The capitalist seeks to maximize profit, which requires minimizing labor costs. The worker seeks to maximize wages and working conditions, which cuts into profit. This contradiction cannot be resolved through compromise because it is rooted in the structure of production itself. So long as one class owns the means of production and another must sell its labor to survive, their relationship will always be antagonistic. This antagonism, sometimes hidden, sometimes erupting into open conflict, is the real force directing the movement of history. Every major transformation in society has occurred because the existing mode of production became incompatible with the needs and power of the oppressed class. Slavery gave way to feudalism through struggle. Feudalism collapsed under the rise of the bourgeoisie, who fought fiercely against the old aristocratic order. And today, capitalism persists only because the working class has not yet fully recognized its collective strength. But the same contradiction exists: a majority that produces the wealth and a minority that appropriates it. As exploitation deepens, as inequality widens, the pressure of class struggle intensifies beneath the surface. Workers may not always be conscious of the struggle, but they live its reality daily. The rising cost of living, job insecurity, and constant pressure to produce more reflect capitalism's continuous attempt to extract greater surplus from labor. Eventually, these pressures make consciousness inevitable. Material conditions push workers toward awareness, and awareness pushes them toward collective action. Whether slow or sudden, this awakening transforms class struggle from a silent force into an explicit movement that challenges the foundations of society. At that point, history reaches another turning point, powered once again by the irreconcilable conflict between classes. Class struggle does not wait for permission, nor does it depend on recognition. It is the engine of history, operating relentlessly, with or without the workers' awareness, until the contradictions of the present system demand a new world built on different foundations. Only collective organization can transform awakening into power, because awareness on its own, no matter how deep or widespread, remains fragile without the structures, unity, and coordinated force necessary to challenge the organized power of the ruling class. Consciousness is the spark, but organization is the mechanism that turns individual insight into collective strength. Throughout history, workers have awakened to their exploitation countless times, but without organization their anger has often burned out, been redirected, or been crushed. The bourgeoisie is not merely a group of wealthy individuals, it is an organized class, equipped with institutions, laws, media, and a state apparatus designed to protect its interests. To confront such a force requires more than isolated acts of defiance. It requires a conscious, united, disciplined movement of workers who understand that their liberation depends not on individual resilience, but on the power of collective action. Awakening reveals the truth of exploitation, but organization creates the means to resist it. When workers come together, they discover that their struggles are not personal failures or private burdens, but shared conditions imposed by the same system. This shared recognition dissolves the illusion of isolation that capitalism cultivates and replaces it with solidarity. In isolation, a worker has no leverage. They can be replaced, ignored, or suppressed. But when workers act together, they become irreplaceable. A factory cannot run, a transport system cannot operate, a market cannot function without the cooperation of the laboring masses. Collective organization transforms this latent power into an active force capable of shaping events. Organization brings discipline, strategy, and continuity. It ensures that struggles are not temporary outbursts, but sustained movements with direction and purpose. Capitalism thrives on chaos, on weakening workers through unpredictability and fragmentation. Collective structures, unions, councils, assemblies, parties, and worker cooperatives provide stability where the system provides only insecurity. They create a space where workers can analyze their conditions, debate tactics, elect leaders, and plan coordinated actions. Through organization, workers move from spontaneous resistance to planned struggle, from reactive anger to proactive transformation. Without such structures, consciousness remains scattered, unable to counter the entrenched systems of power that the ruling class controls. Collective organization also breaks the fear that capitalism uses to keep workers obedient. The fear of losing a job, the fear of retaliation, the fear of standing alone, these are powerful tools of control. But when workers organize, fear shifts from the individual to the collective. One worker striking alone risks everything. 1,000 workers striking together create a crisis for the employer. Through solidarity, workers learn that strength is not an attribute of individuals, but a relationship among them. The ruling class knows this, which is why it invests so heavily in anti-union laws, propaganda against collective action, and tactics meant to divide workers. It fears not the individual who understands exploitation, but the collective that intends to end it. Organization amplifies the voice of the working class. In a society where wealth determines who is heard, individual complaints are dismissed, but collective demands cannot be ignored. Through organization, workers gain negotiating power, legal recognition, media presence, and political influence. They force the ruling class to respond not out of benevolence, but out of necessity. Every major gain workers have achieved: shorter workdays, safer conditions, higher wages. Social protections has come not from enlightenment of the bourgeoisie, but from organized pressure applied by the working class. Without organization, awakening remains a moral insight. With organization, it becomes a historical force. Collective organization also elevates consciousness from awareness of suffering to understanding of systems. When workers organize, they learn not only to resist individual injustices, but to analyze the roots of those injustices in the structure of capitalism itself. They develop political education, share experiences, refine theories, and cultivate leaders from within their own ranks. Organization turns scattered knowledge into collective wisdom. It transforms anger into ideology, frustration into strategy, and isolated complaints into revolutionary demands. Through this process, workers begin to see beyond immediate injustices and envision new systems built on equality, cooperation, and shared ownership. Most importantly, collective organization creates the possibility of transforming society as a whole. Individually, workers can resist, protest, or negotiate, but they cannot overthrow a system that exploits them. Collectively, they can. They can disrupt production, halt distribution, challenge institutions, build alternative structures, and eventually seize control over the means of production themselves. The ruling class maintains power because it is organized. The working class can gain power only by becoming more organized than those who exploit them. When awakening merges with organization, workers cease to be passive subjects of history and become its active makers. Only then can the energy of consciousness be transformed into the force capable of reshaping the world. In the end, the truth stands unmistakable. A sleeping world remains unchanged, but an awakened class becomes the architect of a new society. The workers who begin to see through the illusions of capitalism, who recognize their own labor as the source of all wealth, who understand that inequality is engineered and not accidental, become impossible to govern through deception. Awakening shatters the myths that sustain the ruling class, but awakening alone is not enough. Only when consciousness becomes collective, when isolated insights merge into shared determination, when workers join hands across every division imposed upon them, does their awareness transform into real power. The oppressed discover that they are not alone, not powerless, not destined to live under systems built for the wealth of the few. They find strength in unity, clarity in struggle, and purpose in organization. And in that unity lies the force capable of ending exploitation, seizing back the wealth they create, and reshaping society according to human need rather than profit. History belongs to those who recognize their role in it, and the future belongs to the working class that refuses to remain asleep any longer.